Do you not remember what that was like? Hey, welcome to The Whole Truth, where I am taking you through the entire Bible from Genesis all the way to Revelation without skipping anything. So if that sounds good to you, reach down, hit the little subscribe button below. Then I want you to head over to thewholetruthbiblestudies.com and you'll see all of the videos in one convenient location. There's ways to support the channel, like by getting a cool t-shirt or Bible studies that are over there. So I hope that you'll head over to thewholetruthbiblestudies.com and check out that website. Now, more importantly than any of those things, Deuteronomy chapter 24, and then we're going to pick up in verse 5. So I want you to pause the video and go get your Bible. Hopefully you didn't pause it too fast and you heard that part. Go get your Bible and turn it to Deuteronomy chapter 24 and verse 5, as we're going to see this kind of list of laws. It's like we've seen a few of these chapters where it's like, kind of rapid fire, this and this and this and this, but there's always a common thread. One of the things that I remember being taught in hermeneutics classes in seminary was to look for the common thread, look for the commonality in the chapters. If I'm reading through a chapter, let's look at the context and let's find, what is the common theme that's being recorded. And the one I would point out in Deuteronomy 24 is, don't you remember? Don't you remember what it was like to be in Egypt? Remember what it was like when you all were a slave people and what that felt like. And remember what it was like when you were the poor person. Remember what that was like, what that felt like. And then treat other people accordingly. Not treat them as if I'm going to be spiteful towards them, but treat them with kindness, treat them with respect, treat them the way that you would have wanted to be treated when you were in the position that maybe they're in. That's the theme that you'll see. It's going to be this rapid fire law, like don't do this, do this, do this, don't do this. It's going to kind of be that all back and forth. And they don't seem like they all tie together at first until you start to think, all of these are saying, remember what it was like. We'll take a few of these at a time. Well, really, we'll just take one at a time. And so about 20 minutes or so, about 20, 25 minutes, we'll go through these verses and finish up Deuteronomy 24. So I hope I've given you time to go grab your Bible and turn it open to Deuteronomy chapter 24 and verse 5. Read along with me. When a man has taken a new wife, he shall not go out to war or be charged with any business. He shall be free at home 1 year and bring happiness to his wife whom he has taken. Now, this is one of those laws that we do not see practiced, at least announced in the Bible. We see that it is stated, but we've never seen a story where a man was taking his year with his wife. I actually love this law. The law says, hey, when you take a wife, then take a year off and spend that year with your wife. Don't send that young man to war. Don't send him off so that he cannot be with his wife. Let him be at home for 1 year with his wife. I love that God made a provision for a couple. It's, in my mind, especially envision a young couple. And I could even say to that, don't you remember what it was like to be young and in love? Throughout the Bible, we see these laws, and the law always feels cold. It feels like it's lacking something. It feels like it's lacking in love, and it feels like it's lacking in grace. And so we read these laws about divorce or slavery, or, what do you do with people after you've been to war? Like, what do you do with these prisoners of war? And what do you do with the captives? And we read these things and they feel so cold. And so I love this little bit of light that comes in. And it's not a little bit of light in the Bible. Forgive me for making it sound like that, but you know what I mean. Like, it seems like this glimmer of, like, there's a love that's there that says, hey, a man and a woman in the ancient world, when they came together, they still fell in love just like we do today. And when a man takes a new wife, don't send that man off to war. Let him be home with his wife for 1 year. Don't purposefully send him out. Now, certainly people could try to abuse that and try to use it to get out of going to war or something of that nature, but that's not the purpose of what this law is. This law is to say, hey, do you remember what it's like to be young and in love and to have a wife? Don't send somebody, don't let a man take a wife and then directly send him off to war and then potentially even widow that woman. Make sure that you take care of that young couple. Let's look at what happens in verse 6. It won't seem like it ties together, except for this one theme, which is remember what it was like. Here it is. It's in verse 6. No man shall take the lower or the upper millstone in pledge, for he takes one's living in pledge. So we have to understand what they mean by a pledge. It's exactly what it says, but have you ever made a pledge to like a child who's in like a fundraiser? You ever done that? You know, like I pledge if you walk so many miles, I will give you $1 for every mile that you walk. And then the kids go out and they walk 10 miles and you give them $10 towards their fundraiser. You ever done that? Like if you do this, I'll pledge to give you this. Okay. In a similar way, just like we would have today, we might have a down payment on something or like a good faith payment or something of that nature. In the same way, this is what they had in the Old Testament in the ancient time. They would say, okay, I need to borrow this money. I need to give you something, a collateral, if you will, so that you can know that I'm going to pay you back from the thing that I'm lending to, or from the thing that you're lending to me, that I'm going to pay you back. I'm going to have to give you a pledge to make sure that you'll pay that back. Do not take, in the ancient world, do not take the upper or the lower millstone. Now we have to understand a millstone. A millstone would have been two stones stacked on top of each other. By the way, when you're in seminary, you go through these classes called manners and customs. And you can learn a lot of these things that I'm talking about today. If you look up manners and customs, you could look up on Amazon, you could look up manners and customs of the Old Testament. There's lots of books, manners and customs of the Old Testament. And so you could have two millstones. You would have two millstones. One would be usually a stationary stone on the bottom, and then there would be another stone that would go on top. And that stone on top would be the one that would spin. And that one that would spin, that's why somebody would grind at the mill. A smaller one could be something that somebody could do by hand, that they could turn the top one by hand. Larger ones, they would have spokes coming out of them, and they would hook up a donkey or an ox, and the donkey or the ox would walk through, and they would have a hole in the middle of that top stone, and you would feed the grain through. The grain would go through. They would have little grooves on the bottom of that top stone, and then as the grain would fall through, it would fall into those grooves, and you would turn and turn, and guess what comes out of the other side? Flour. You would crush it into flour. Well, what happens if you take somebody's upper or lower millstone? If you take it away, there's no grinding. You can't make flour. God said when you take a pledge from somebody, you do not take his upper or his lower millstone. The spirit of this law is to say you do not take away somebody's means of living, somebody's means of providing, or somebody's means of eating. You don't take that away to say, until you give me whatever back, I'm taking your means of living. Don't you remember what it was like to be slaves in Egypt? We haven't read that yet, but it's coming up later in the chapter. Don't you remember what it was like when you were slaves in Egypt? You know, a thing that I think of is the story of Pharaoh getting angry with the Israelite people when they were still enslaved to him. And he says, take away the hay. Don't let them have any hay to make the bricks, but don't lighten the brick load. They have to make the same amount of bricks every single day, but we're not going to give them hay as a filler to do it, as a binding agent. So he made it more difficult for them to do it. And the task was just impossible. They literally couldn't do it. They're being whipped. Their backs are being whipped to make as many, but they can't physically do it because they don't have the hay, because Pharaoh took it away. Even worse in this case, could you imagine somebody saying, okay, I'll give you what you're asking for, but give me your upper millstone. If I give you my upper millstone, how can I make flour? And you can imagine the person saying, exactly. That's the point. God says when they make a pledge and you lend to them, do it kindly. Now, look, here's the next one in verse 7. If a man is found kidnapping any of his brethren of the children of Israel and mistreats him or sells him, then the kidnapper shall die, and you shall put away the evil from among you. Don't let a kidnapper survive in your cities. Now, remember, if we haven't stated this in this video, this is God talking to Moses, giving Moses those laws for Moses to give them to the people of Israel, getting ready to go into the promised land. God to Moses, Moses to the people are going into the promised land. When you're in the promised land, do not let a kidnapper survive. If a man is kidnapping children, especially to sell them, that's what he says here, is kidnapping children to sell them, put that person to death. Well, do you know what we have happening in our world right now today? Human trafficking. It's a huge thing. And much of human trafficking is still happening among children. Children are kidnapped and sold into human trafficking every day, even in the United States. It's a crazy thing to think. I mean, I think of like my children and my home and how much I want to keep them safe and protected. The idea that somebody would take a child, kidnap that child, and then sell that child or traffic that child, or even maybe not kidnap them. We have parents that traffic their children in our country, even today, moms that would sell their daughters or their sons. My brain cannot totally wrap around that. But you know what? I'm going to say a really strong thing. If we would implement these type of laws, if we would put those people who get caught doing that, put them to death, give them the death penalty, I'd bet you those numbers would go way down of those people participating in such heinous acts. You know, we allow that stuff through the law. Somebody might say, we don't allow it. We don't make provisions for it, but we certainly do. Laws are made to protect criminals, and those who do wrong continue to do wrong because they know that the consequence is not their life. But if they had to think twice about whether or not they themselves would survive this if caught, I bet they would stop that stuff. And again, we can go to this. Remember what it was like, Israel, when you were in slavery in Egypt, because there were those who took your children and put them to work in other places. Don't you remember what that was like? Get that evil out of your country. Now, remember, we're talking through these laws in Deuteronomy 24 that don't exactly seem like they go together, but now we're seeing this theme. Let's look again. This one is now in verse 8. Take heed in an outbreak of leprosy, that you carefully observe and do according to all that the priest, the Levites, shall teach you. Just as I commanded them, so you shall be careful to do. Remember what the Lord your God did to Miriam in the way when you came out of Egypt. Now, that last part seemed a little confusing. If you see the context, if there's an outbreak of leprosy, the people who have leprosy, be careful to do exactly what the priest and the Levites would tell you to do. Well, what do the priest and the Levites tell somebody with leprosy to do? So leprosy is a skin disease that they would have in the Old Testament, in the ancient world. A lot of skin diseases would get classified as leprosy, kind of a blanket term, leprosy. Well, so here's what you do. If somebody has leprosy, they're to go to the priest and the Levites. If they are found with leprosy, they're separated, they're quarantined away from all of the people. They have to go out of the city crying, unclean, unclean. They have to go to a place separate from everybody else. And they have to wait for that leprosy to clear up. And even once they find that it looks clear, they have to come back to the priest and the Levites. The Levites and the priest have to examine them, check the skin disease. And if it does look like it's clearing up, they have to still be separated for 7 more days to make sure that it completely clears up and that there's no issues. Now, we've had some other lessons on leprosy, and those you can find in the Leviticus series. Again, if you wanted to find those easily, you could go to thewholetruthbiblestudy.com and you could find the Leviticus series. Also, YouTube's playlists are a little bit easier to navigate. Of course, the further we get through this series, the more those playlists are. The more of those playlists that there are, the harder that might become to navigate. So the website's probably still the easiest means to find those. So that's the leprosy side of things. What is this whole remember Miriam? God's telling his people, instructing Moses to tell the people, when you go into the land, if there's a leprosy outbreak, do exactly what the priests tell you. But then he brings up this Miriam thing. He says, remember what God did with Miriam. Well, what happened with Miriam? Miriam was struck with leprosy. She went and presented herself to the priest and the Levites, and even Miriam, a prominent woman in Israel, guess what happened with her? She had to quarantine for 7 days. She had to be separate for 7 days. Why is that important? What's God saying? He's telling the people in Israel, no matter who you are, if there's an outbreak of leprosy, you have to quarantine. You can't spread that. You have to think about what it must be like if you, the person who's contracted leprosy, you must quarantine. You can't say, well, I have a job to do, or I have something that I must do. I can't, excuse me. You can't say, I can't separate myself. No, even Miriam was quarantined. If the priest and Levites tell you to quarantine, then you must quarantine. I can think about when I used to work at my own business. This was a hard thing. If somebody was sick, there was always this we're men and we want to push through. It's like my dad and myself and my brother, and we were the ones doing most of the manual labor. Of course, we hired people over the years or whatever, but there was this kind of nobody outworks the walkers. Nobody outworks the guys who own the business. We're going to be there, and we push through no matter what it was. And this was kind of a thing in our own heads, but certainly it was a thing that was seen, because what would happen would be this, my dad or my brother or myself, we would get sick, and then we would try to go to work. We'd be like, no, I got to get my work done. And of course, the other people in the shop would be like, get out of here, go home. You can't be here when you're sick. You have to go home. You're going to make me sick. If you're here while you're sick, you're going to make me sick. That's the same thing we're seeing here about this leprosy. Don't give it to somebody else thinking that you don't have to do what the priest and the Levites say. No, you're doing that because of care for the other person. You're doing that because of care for your brothers and your sisters in your community. That's the reason that you would be doing that. Okay, look now in verse 10. When you lend your brother anything, you shall not go into his house to get his pledge. You shall stand outside, and the man to whom you lend shall bring the pledge out to you. And if the man is poor, you shall not keep his pledge overnight. You shall in any case return the pledge to him again when the sun goes down, that he may sleep in his own garment and bless you. And it shall be righteousness to you before the Lord your God. I love this part as well. If a man makes a pledge, now remember, in the pledge, what can the man not do? He cannot give he should not take the upper millstone or the lower millstone from a man in a pledge. But what could he pledge? Well, it has to be something of value. And you get a clue into what that value is here as you see that the man should return the man's cloak or his tunic at the end of the night. What would that mean? That the man who was poor, all he had of value was his coat. So he takes off his overcoat, and that's what he gives in the pledge. The man lending says, I'll lend you this. I mean, you can imagine it like this. A man says, I need jars to hold the flour that I'm grinding, but I can't afford to buy the pots. But if I could get the pots, I could fill them up with the flour, and then I could sell them, and I'll make the money back for them. And so this other man who's got the money says, I'll give you the money for the pots. The guy takes his coat and gives him his coat so that he can get the money to buy the pots, to put the flour in so that he can sell them, so he can provide for his family, and he'll be able to pay for the pots. The man who lent the money is supposed to take this other man's coat back to him that evening. That way the man has something to sleep under that night. And the Lord says, and this shall be righteousness to that man. Why is that righteousness to that man? Why does the Lord love to see that? Because we are treating others the way that the Lord has treated us. The Lord is the one who's provided for us, and we ought to be the ones to help to provide for others. We should remember what the Lord has done for us. As somebody myself, I relate when I read these things about taking care of the poor, and I can really appreciate them. I can really appreciate it because I, at one time, was poor. I spent several years of my life very poor, and it was such a difficult time. I remember one time there being some sort of a get-together, family get-together. I don't remember if it was a graduation or a wedding or what it was. But I remember literally not being able to go because things were so tight that if we went to that, we didn't have enough money to buy gas. And we had a tiny little car. We had a little 2003 Ford Focus. And so, that thing, this was gas at that time. It was under Obama, so it was high. I mean, it was like $4 a gallon or something like that. But even at $4 a gallon, I think it was a 10-gallon tank. And so, $40 to fill up the gas tank, to put gas in the car. And this was not a full tanks away of a get together. We're talking about, I'm looking at it going, I can't go 10 extra miles this week because 10 extra miles would be half a tank of gas, and I just don't have it. I remember thinking to myself at times that I was going to have to walk to work because I just didn't have enough money to put gas in the tank. I never had to do that. The Lord always provided for me, but I certainly remember those days of scrimping by. There was a local church that had, they called them angel food boxes. And these angel food boxes were where we could buy wholesale priced food. You didn't get any choice of what was in the box. There was a box put together with beans and noodles and rice and spaghetti sauce and just whatever they had put down, kind of staple items in these boxes. And it was about $80 worth of food, but you could buy it for $30. And so we would have to go and we would stand in this line outside of this church. My wife and I would go stand in this line outside of this church there with our kids. And we would go in and go buy an angel food box. And sometimes if we had done really well, we would be able to buy 2 boxes. I remember those days. And so when I read things like this, I appreciate the fact that the Lord has a heart for those who are poor or those who are needy or those who are destitute, or like I'm in the position I'm in now. I'm definitely not poor now. The Lord has provided for me in so many ways financially, but I'm a widower and the Lord takes care of widowers. It's interesting when you've been in that position, what it feels like when you see somebody else going through that same thing. I'll give you another quick little story I saw recently. There's this viral video going around of a young woman. She's a blonde woman. It's been going viral that she's crying on the video and she's making her own birthday cake. And she's got it, and you know that because she's got it captioned, when you're a single mom making your own birthday cake so that your kids have something to give you on your birthday. And she's crying and making this cake. And it's interesting to look down through the comments. I'm not even trying to say what my opinion is on that video, other than just that if you look down through the comments, you see all of these women who are single moms defending this young woman, and all of these people who are not single moms, maybe some of them are, but you see all these people saying, oh, that was so dumb. She shouldn't be crying on camera like that. She should be embarrassed, blah, 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 blah. I even saw Matt Walsh, who I really like, and he made a video kind of condemning what she was doing. And my point is only this: it resonated with those single moms who could relate and say, I know what that feels like. I know what that feels like to be where you are. It's interesting once you've been in a position that you know what that feels like, and then the way that you want to treat the person who's going through the same thing that you've been through. Okay, check this out with me. We got to keep going. This is now in verse 14. You shall not oppress a hired servant who is poor and needy, whether one of your brethren or one of the aliens who is in your land within your gates. Each day you shall give him his wages, and not let the sun go down on it, for he is poor, and his heart and has set his heart on it, lest he cry out against you to the Lord, and it be sin to you. I love this one as well. Again, we're dealing with those who are a servant, and it's don't oppress the servant. Don't make things harder on the servant because he's a servant. As a matter of fact, go above and beyond. Don't even hold his wages for a week or 2 weeks. We see that today with maybe your employer. Do you have an employer that you get paid once a month, or once every other week, or even once a week? Most employers would say we pay once a week. Have you ever been in that position where you got hired, but you were in between the pay period? This happened to me a couple of times early on before I owned my own business, that I had a job, I'd taken a job, and I needed money. I got the job, I needed the money, and they had a biweekly pay schedule, and it went like 3 weeks before I ever got my first paycheck. And then when I got my first paycheck, it was only for 1 week. I had been 3 weeks with no pay, and then when I finally got my paycheck, it was 1 week. Man, that was tough to go through that, and then to try to navigate what that was like. And here I was, just an entry-level job at a restaurant, and I finally get my first paycheck after 3 weeks of working, and it's $200 or $250. I just remember looking, being like, how am I going to make this work? God said, when you have a hired servant, don't oppress him. And not only that, give him his wages each day. Pay him every day. Don't let the sun go down before you pay him. Take care of him. Don't you remember you were slaves in Egypt? Remember what it was like when you were the servants. Remember what that was like. Well, let's keep going. In verse 16, fathers shall not be put to death for their children, nor shall children be put to death for their fathers. A person shall be put to death for his own sin. So God's making another provision here. No death by association. This one's a hard one because we see it and we would say, yeah, we wouldn't want to put somebody to death because of what his dad did or because of what his mom did or some relation to somebody. But yet many times in our personal lives, we absolutely give death by association. If we are friends with somebody who's going through a divorce, their spouse that they've divorced, we tend to think very low of that person, that other person, don't we? Many times forgetting that there's two sides to every story and that other person on that other side has their own version of what's been going on. But we definitely have our own version of death by association in many ways. Many times those who have gone through something or done something, their children pay the price for that. Now, certainly this is a law that is related to Israel and very specific. You can't, if a father sins, you don't kill his son because the father has done something. You charge the father for his sin and you charge the son for his own sin, but you don't have to blend those two. Certainly that is a law about putting those to death. I'm simply saying that we do some of this today in that we associate this person did me wrong, and so now I'm going to mistreat their children, or I'm going to mistreat. I'm not saying that we would be purposefully we're not going to retaliate and eye for an eye kind of a thing, but certainly do we say, well, we don't hang around them because their mom did. We don't hang around them because their dad did or those people did. We kind of relate them together and put them all in the same boat. The Bible said here, God told the people, don't punish the son for what the father has done. Don't put to death the son for the father or the father for the son. Those should be charged for their own sins. Well, keep looking with me. It's now in verse 17. And you shall not pervert justice, do the stranger or the fatherless, nor take a widow's garment as a pledge. But you shall remember that you were a slave in Egypt, and the Lord your God redeemed you from there. Therefore, I command you to do this thing. Don't pervert justice for the fatherless. Okay, so it goes like this. If a young man was fatherless and he didn't have a father to protect him, and he's now before the court, he's before the city gate, before the elders of the city. That's how they would do it in the ancient world. Here he is. Don't pervert justice on him. Don't make things harder on him because you simply can, or because you need to make an example out of somebody. Don't pervert justice for the fatherless or for the alien or for the stranger. Don't pervert justice on them. The same rule that applies for everyone else applies for the fatherless, and the same thing goes in return. We don't treat somebody because he's more prominent. We don't change the laws for him in that way, which we've already talked about before. And the same thing in the reverse. We don't make things worse or harder on those who are poor or destitute when it comes to the law. There's no judgment for this person being fatherless. Don't take advantage of him. That's really what we're hearing in those verses, is don't take advantage of someone. And we're hearing the same thing with the widow. Don't take the garment of a widow. Just like you might you're not to take the millstone of somebody and take away their livelihood. If a woman is a widow and she has to take a loan from you, you are not even to take her tunic as a pledge. You are not to mistreat someone in that way. And that's what God meant by don't pervert justice for the fatherless or for the stranger or and don't take a pledge, the widow. And then here we see it. This is that connecting part. Don't you remember what it was like when you were slaves in Egypt, when you were the fatherless, when you were the widow, when you were in that position? Don't you remember what that was like? And did you want to be treated that way? Did you want to have somebody making it harder on you because you were simply trying to survive? There's one more that's given, and I love this last one so much. It's in verse 19. When you reap your harvest in your field and forget a sheaf in the field, you shall not go back and get get it. It shall be for the stranger, the fatherless, and the widow, that the Lord your God may bless you in all the work of your hands. When you beat your olive trees, you shall not go over the boughs again. It shall be for the stranger, the fatherless, and the widow. When you gather the grapes in your vineyard, you shall not glean it afterward. It shall be for the stranger, the fatherless, and the widow. And you shall remember that you were a slave in the land of Egypt. Therefore, I command you to do this thing. I love these parts. There's several of them throughout the laws about reaping your harvest. And it goes like this. Don't go back and pick the harvest clean when you go through the grapes, and you get your harvest. Don't send somebody back through to make sure that you didn't miss anything. If you missed something, leave it. Leave it because you're leaving it for the fatherless, the poor, and the widow. You see this happen in the book of Ruth. If you've never read the book of Ruth, it's 4 chapters. You could sit down this afternoon and read the book of Ruth. It's a beautiful story. And it starts out with this woman who's lost her husband and lost her 2 sons, and her sons' wives, her daughter-in-laws were with her. And the one, Ruth, ends up going back home with her, and they're poor and they're destitute. And Ruth has to go out and go glean in the field. And that would mean that after the harvesters have gone through and got all the food, Ruth could go and get the leftover. And that's what she was gleaning from the leftover. And I love the story as Boaz is so kind to her, and he gives her extra every day and sends her home with extra, so much extra that her mother-in-law, who had also lost her husband, Ruth had lost her husband, and Naomi, her mother-in-law, lost her husband. They were both widows living together. And when she goes home, Naomi, Ruth's mother-in-law, says, "Where'd you get all this?" And she says, "Well, the man gave it to me. He provided for me and gave me all of this extra to help take care of her." I love that story. I love this part right here where we see that God makes this provision and says, if you forget a sheaf, leave it. If you go through and get your grapes, leave whatever's left over. If you beat the olive tree, they would shake the olive tree or beat the olive tree and get all the olives to fall down. When all the olives have fallen down, take what's there, but don't go back and shake it a second time. Don't go back and beat it a second time or go over it again. Leave the extra olives, and that way those who are fatherless or poor or destitute, the widow, they can go and they can get from it. Certainly, yeah, could you get a little bit more profit? Yeah, you could get a little bit more profit, but leave it. Leave that extra so that they can be taken care of. I want to tell you this one little story as I close out today. I told you earlier in the video that I went through a portion of my life where I was poor, and I was. And in the midst of that, there was a man who came into my store, and I had a fabric and upholstery store, and he had ordered a couple of sofas. He had ordered a couch, and we're talking custom built sofas, and custom built sofas are not cheap. And even though my prices were not super high and I was not doing well financially myself, things were getting better, but I was not doing great for myself. This man ordered a couple of sofas, and they were like $3,000 each. And he ordered 2 of them, $6,000 worth of sofas. I thought we had done great. I was so excited. I was, this was going to be good. We were going to build these sofas. We were going to upholster them. But that means that we got the sale of the wood. We got extra labor from that. We got the sale of all the foam, of all the stuff that went on the inside, all the springs, things that are normally there when I would reupholster something. Then I got to sell all of those. So there's extra money there. And then the sale of the fabric, and then to get all the upholstery to put it all on. So these things were like $3,000 per sofa. And so $6,000 for these custom built sofas, 2 of them. And I just thought we were going to have a great week. And, we built these sofas for this guy. And he said, I can't pay. I'm so sorry. I've lost my job. And we were just devastated. But we held the sofas. We said, okay, well, let us know what you can do. He said, I'll try to make some installments. And he did. He came and he made a few installments, a few $100. Every couple of weeks, he'd come in and try to pay a little bit. And he would be so apologetic. He just had this terrible look on his face. And then we found out he was putting his house up for sale. He had lost his job and he couldn't keep his home. And I remember we talked amongst our family, and we took those sofas and we put them in the trailer. We called him and we said, hey, are you going to be home? And he said yes. And we drove those sofas out to him, and we just gifted him the sofas. And we gifted him the sofas because we knew what it was like to be in his position, to have gone from, being doing well, thinking he could buy $6,000 worth of sofas, and then losing his job. We knew what that felt like. And so we went and we took him the sofas and we gave him the sofas. And certainly in that moment of like, he couldn't pay and we just built these sofas, there was kind of that shock moment. But what I'm saying to you is we could relate to what he had been through because we had been through it. And so we wanted to be kind to him. That's what God was telling Israel to do. And I would just ask you the same thing. Would you be willing to recognize today the things that you've been through, that God's been with you and walked with you through? And then he's encouraging us to treat others in that way. That's the way that Jesus taught us. He taught us to do unto others the way that we would want them to do unto us, to treat others the way that we would want to be treated. Did you know that that golden rule came from Jesus? And certainly God lived that. God, who is high above us, sent his only son, Jesus, to come here for us. And here's the truth, that now we do not worship a God who's not been touched with our infirmities. But in every way, he was tempted the same way that we are, and yet is without sin. Jesus has experienced everything that we've experienced, and therefore we can put our trust in him, knowing that he not only created us and knows because he just has all knowledge, but he literally experienced everything that we've experienced, so he can relate with us. He gets us. He knows us. He knows you, and he knows what you're going through, and you can trust him with everything that you need. Well, this has been a long video. Goodness gracious, 37 minutes. It'll probably be a little shorter once I do some cutting on it, but that's my clock right now says 37 minutes. I hope you've enjoyed today's video, and I hope you come back tomorrow as we get into Deuteronomy chapter 25. I'll see you then.